When I first saw the teaser for the One Piece live action months ago, I said I thought it looked bad. I could not be more happy to have been wrong. The One Piece live action has exceeded expectations for me completely, and I'm genuinely looking forward to Season 2, as well as to binging Season 1 again at some point. Now, does that mean that I think the show was, from a critical perspective, great? Well, there are two ways to evaluate the show, and I think most reactions from One Piece fans right now are getting these two perspectives mixed up. The first way to evaluate it is how good of a One Piece adaptation is this? Meaning that as a One Piece fan, do you feel like this brought the series you love to life? Did it do justice to the source material? Did it recreate certain scenes and characters faithfully? And did the changes that it made elevate the story rather than detract from it? The second way to evaluate this show is as a neutral viewer, as a critic with no prior context of One Piece, and just evaluating it as a random new fantasy TV show about pirates. In that regard, does this completely new TV show offer a compelling story? Are the characters engaging? Is it well directed? Is the writing polished? And so on. I think both perspectives are equally important to consider the show from, so I'm going to first give my thoughts on what I feel about this One Piece adaptation from the perspective of me as a One Piece fan, and then I'm going to break it down from a neutral perspective of how good I actually feel it was as a TV show in terms of action, scene direction, dialogue, story, character writing, acting, and so on. So let's get into it. The series adapted so much so faithfully, and there were a lot of things I didn't even realize that they would be able to pull off, like Mihawk cutting a ship or Luffy bringing down Arlong Park. As a One Piece fan, I think I'm just happy to be seeing so much of what I enjoyed in the anime and the manga brought to life, and there are too many individual things to get into. So I know that what people mostly want to discuss are the changes, the things that are different from the manga. And in my opinion, the vast majority of the changes to the East Blue storyline that took place in the live action actually made the storyline even stronger than in the manga. Now you might be saying, Morge, how could you ever claim that someone else could write One Piece better than Oda already did? Well, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying that the writer, Matt Owens, has full knowledge of the entirety of One Piece, and so he can retell any early part of the story in an even more interesting way. For example, I think most One Piece fans would agree that in the manga, the Robin storyline of her leaving the crew and having to be saved in Water 7 and Enies Lobby is very similar to Nami's storyline of leaving the crew and having to be saved in Arlong Park. It's just that Robin's storyline has a lot more elements added to it to heighten the stakes, drama, and emotion of the situation. The Straw Hats are actually defeated by CP9. Luffy has to watch Robin leave with CP9 in front of his eyes. The entire crew is in disarray and falling apart with Usopp and the Merry issues added in. Luffy is struggling with his burdens as a captain throughout the arc, etc, etc. So guess what? The One Piece live action smartly decided to beef up the Nami storyline in East Blue by pulling from those future elements of Robin's storyline in Enies Lobby. It's a lot of the same beats that we see in the live action. Arlong actually defeats Luffy the first time around. Nami ditches Luffy for Arlong in front of Luffy's eyes. The entire crew is lost with Nami gone and Zoro near death. Luffy is struggling throughout the arc with whether or not he has what it takes to be a good captain. All of these added elements make for a much more powerful turnaround when the crew finally gets their resolve back and gets back up to go save Nami. It makes East Blue, which was already a dramatic storyline, that much more dramatic, because the live action gets to draw upon Oda's future improvements as a writer to enhance an earlier storyline. So when viewers complain that they changed the plot of East Blue, I sit back and look at it and say, yeah, they did. This is a better plot. It's a more dramatic plot. And the other thing the live action did really well was the build-up to this final conflict. The East Blue saga in the manga is very much a disconnected series of short stories. There are light references early on to Nami having some sort of trauma that needs to be dealt with down the line, but other than that, there really is no overarching storyline for the saga in the manga. East Blue becomes much more interesting when you actually build the entire saga around one central conflict that everything is leading up to, like the live action did, which is why setting up Nami being a traitor in episode 2 was good. Establishing Arlong as the final villain in episode 3 was good. There is actual momentum and purpose being built into the narrative much earlier on, as opposed to the more casual, meandering nature of the manga where it's more like, let's find some crewmates and eventually go to the Grand Line. Again, this is not a knock on East Blue in the manga. It had a very deliberately lackadaisical pace to ease us into the story, but for a Western TV show adaptation, you need a clear, overarching plot that is heading towards some sort of a breaking point to keep people invested. Another great plot change that the show made was mixing up the nature of the Straw Hats' adventures, while still hitting the same beats. In the manga in East Blue, there's a sort of rinse-repeat of the Straw Hats showing up at a new island, slowly learning about it, meeting new characters, meeting the villain, defeating them, and so on. But in the live action, they introduced more twists and turns with how things were paced out. Right after we leave the Marine base, the Straw Hats are actually ambushed at sea by the Buggy Pirates. It's a sudden shift that throws them into the Lion's Den right away, and the rest of the episode is the Straw Hats fighting for their lives. Whereas at Syrup Village, the live action actually flips the script, and the show goes all in on this sort of slow, developing murder mansion plotline in a very tight, enclosed space. Basically, the live action makes an effort to get into a less predictable rhythm, because any modern Western TV show, be that Stranger Things or The Boys or whatever, wants to keep viewers guessing. And I sure hope no one is complaining about cutting Dawn Krieg, because that is just to me an obviously great choice. It cuts down on the repetitive feeling of new villain of the week by simply segueing into the far more important final conflict of the story of Nami and Arlong, and giving that more time and room to breathe. Not to mention by cutting Luffy's victory over Dawn Krieg, and instead making Baratie a low point of defeat for the heroes across the board, it sets up the heroes' final rise back up for the Arlong Park climax much better, and thereby gives the entire East Blue saga a much more clear narrative structure than in the manga. More on that later on in the writing section of this review. What I also really appreciated was that, just as a One Piece fan, the show is littered with references and setups and Easter eggs that give you this added sense of joy as you realize how cohesive this world is. The teases of Baroque works from early on, seeing Kabaji at the bar in episode 1 right next to Zoro, even just little decisions that hint at future reveals like Mihawk commenting on Luffy's hat. All of that is great and shows a real love and knowledge of the series. I also love the added tensions between the crew early on. Luffy, Zoro, and Nami don't get along nearly as well in the show as they do in the manga in the first few arcs, but that actually makes them more engaging to watch in a live action format, since you can still see them develop into close friends, but there's a lot of entertaining friction along the way. One of my favorite little scenes was Nami and Zoro roasting each other while they're picking out their outfits in Syrup Village, and Nami ultimately just picking what Zoro is going to wear for him and Zoro actually liking it. The friction isn't overdone, and there's still clearly an understated friendship that is developing for the characters. And lastly, I was surprised at how much I enjoyed Usopp and Kaya's dynamic here and cared about it more than in the manga. The added characterization and time spent with Kaya definitely helped, and actually fleshing out their romance was a good decision in my opinion. But at the same time, while the dynamic between Usopp and Kaya was good, Usopp's overall writing was much worse than in the manga. Now, this is a great example of what I mean by the difference between evaluating this show as a One Piece adaptation versus evaluating this as a TV show. If I were to ignore the source material and just evaluate this as any other TV show, as if I knew nothing about One Piece, then there's actually nothing wrong with Usopp's writing. Because in the average TV show, the reality is that some members of the main cast of characters are always going to be written to be less important than the others. And in any show, you can see that some of the characters will get less time, less development, and less focus compared to the others, especially in the first season of a show. That's just normal and expected. So by the standards of most TV shows, if I'm watching blind, I would say, hey, this Usopp guy seems like the least important of the 5 Straw Hats we have so far, but you know what? Even this guy, even the least important guy, he was still fleshed out, he got a flashback, he got some degree of development. That's pretty good, all things considered. Basically, if I am a neutral viewer, nothing would seem wrong with how Usopp was treated, because I wouldn't know that this guy is supposed to get more story focus. So I don't count Usopp's writing as a real criticism of the show. But as a One Piece fan who loves Usopp and who knows the real potential and depth of the character, man, this was disappointing to see in a One Piece adaptation. Because in my opinion, Usopp, as the most flawed of the Straw Hats, also provides the best character writing out of the Straw Hats. And I kept waiting and waiting on some memorable moment for him in the live action, and it just never came. Yes, Usopp ended up acting bravely in Syrup Village, but it didn't feel like in a particularly impactful way. However, Season 2 is almost guaranteed, and between Little Garden and Alabasta, Usopp still has plenty of potential for moments of character growth ahead. But here is the one big issue that the live action had in terms of changes from the source material: the Garp storyline. So, to be clear, I don't dislike the storyline just because it changed Garp's character to be much more serious and stern. That's fine. I was open to seeing a different take on the character in the adaptation. I accepted that. I do dislike the storyline because it really hurt the plot for this season. And what's interesting is I think a lot of viewers don't fully understand why it was included. Because the annoying part is I can actually see why they wrote it in. Because from a screenwriting perspective, there are two clear reasons why they would have thought that this whole Garp and Kobe hunting Luffy storyline would have been good or even necessary to include. The first and simpler reason would be so that they could have a third running storyline for the season. In modern television, it is basically expected that you have multiple storylines running. For many viewers, it would seem almost off to only be following one group of characters the entire time, maybe even boring. Just for the sake of variety, cutting between multiple storylines is considered good television. Now, the three running storylines in Season 1 were the Straw Hats' adventures, the Arlong Pirates in the background, and the Marines hunting the Straw Hats. The problem is, the Arlong Pirates alone don't offer much, since the most that they can really do is scenes of them capturing and bullying Buggy. So some other storyline becomes a necessity, and the Marines hunting the Straw Hats likely seemed like a good bet, since Kobe and Helmut Poe are already established characters. That's fine on paper, but the problem is what they tried to do with the storyline. Because the other big reason the storyline was included was due to screenwriting rules of how to approach the main character. So, Luffy's flashback begins with Shanks telling Luffy that he is not ready for the seas, and that Luffy doesn't understand the danger associated with chasing his dream. Now, by screenwriting rules, technically, Luffy's story in Season 1 would therefore best end with Luffy at the end of the season proving that he is finally ready for the seas and ready for the danger. That's called a through line. Hence, the entire Marine plot thread is building to this encounter between Luffy and Garp, where Luffy shows Garp that he is ready to chase his dreams and be a pirate, despite Garp trying to hold him back, thereby resolving the through line that started with Luffy being told that he's not ready in the first episode. I recommend you actually go back and re-watch these scenes because it's like a textbook template. Very first scene is Shanks saying, "Luffy, the sea is not a child's game, you're not ready." Then Luffy's final confrontation with Garp in episode 8 is Garp saying, "Luffy, the sea is not a child's game, you're not ready." It's very word for word, on the nose, identical dialogue, but of course the second time around with Garp, Luffy shows that he is ready, so the through line is complete at the end of the season. Now, I can understand why the live action felt they needed to do this. The showrunners likely wanted to do more with Luffy's character development in the live action, since in the manga it really is bare bones for Luffy in East Blue. Like, in the manga, this little conflict of Luffy not being ready for the seas, established in Chapter 1, is literally resolved by the end of Chapter 1, where Luffy one-shots a Sea King, showing that he is trained and is now grown up and ready, before proceeding to then go on to stomp every single pirate in East Blue. But in a live-action show, you want your main character to be more flawed throughout the season. Therefore, building up this clash between Luffy's desire for freedom and chasing his dreams at the risk of his own life, and the authoritarian, overprotective Garp trying to stop him. However, here's the thing. The live action also incorporates an entirely separate, but actually much more effective character conflict for Luffy throughout Season 1. The conflict of Luffy having to deal with the burden of being a captain. That was Luffy's personal conflict throughout Baratie, and ultimately it was resolved when Luffy defeated Arlong and protected his crew, while simultaneously defending his crew's right to pursue their dreams. In my opinion, that was all we really needed for Luffy. I don't think the show needed to double up on character conflicts for Luffy with all the Garp stuff as well, when the Garp stuff felt so forced and Luffy's struggles as a captain in Baratie and Arlong Park felt so organic. Not to mention, that storyline for Luffy already covers a lot of the same stuff that his conflict with Garp later addresses. The value of risking your life for your dreams, the importance of freedom and never allowing yourself to be controlled, and even proving that Luffy is ready for the seas, just as Shanks told him he was not in Episode 1. This is all already covered in Luffy's character arc by the time he defeats Arlong, without the Garp storyline ever being necessary. The final Garp encounter just really hammers all that stuff in again, but in a manner that is frankly somewhat cliche, and it took a very long time to get to. So despite taking up a large part of the runtime, the Garp and Marine storyline in general really had a minimal impact on the plot, and the conclusion of that storyline didn't do much for Luffy that hadn't already been done more effectively by that point. So, all that being said, I mostly enjoyed the changes, and I think that almost every change made for better television, with a few exceptions as I explained. But overall, as a One Piece fan, I genuinely love this adaptation, and I will be watching it again for fun at some point. Now, here is where I'm going to look at it more critically, by how it measures up to the standards of other TV shows as an overall production. A lot of the criticisms I see going around are from a One Piece fan lens, and not actually evaluating this as a show. For instance, saying Garp shouldn't have asked Mihawk to catch Luffy. Garp would never do that, and Mihawk would never do that. That is not a valid criticism of the show. Maybe as a One Piece fan, you don't personally like that, but if you're evaluating it critically as a TV show, guess what? You can't bring your preconceived notions of what Mihawk or Garp should do from the manga and use that as a criticism for what characters in this brand new blank slate TV show are doing. Because if I'm viewing this as a brand new TV show with no prior context, then I actually think it's cool that Garp is calling in some badass warlord dude to do him a favor. It's a good way to introduce this Mihawk character and introduce the concept of warlords. And the fact that Mihawk ultimately disobeys Garp helps establish for me, a new viewer, what to expect from these warlords in the future. So, understanding that I'm going to be reviewing this from here on purely as a show, pretending I'm not a One Piece fan, let's get into it. So I'm surprised more people don't talk about this. If I'm looking at this show as a completely blind viewer, no knowledge of One Piece, then the one thing that stands out the most about this show that would keep me watching beyond the first episode is the action. In a vacuum, if I were rating the One Piece live action by how it compares to other TV shows in every category, writing, directing, acting, etc., the thing that this show does best, by TV standards, is easily the action. Now, that might sound surprising, especially when some of the effects can seem a little iffy, but to be clear, I'm not talking about like Buggy's fight scene or Kuro's super speed stuff. I'm saying, ignoring all the superpowered stuff, a lot of the more grounded action sequences that we got are objectively choreographed way better than 99% of the things that you see on TV. And the simple reason for that is that the actors can actually fight. See, Jackie Chan once explained that when you have a fight scene with a bunch of camera cuts, it's because the actors can't actually fight. That's why even in big budget Marvel movies, so much of the action is just random, unintelligible, choppy shit. But if you look at even just Zoro's first fight with Mr. Seven, well, Zoro's actor Makinyu can fight. He's really well trained and experienced. So if you go watch that fight scene right now, you can see it's extended, fast-paced, high-octane choreography where every move is clear and visible. Then compare that Zoro vs. Mr. 7 fight, which is a random, minor fight in episode 1 of this show, and compare it to something like the Red Viper vs. the Mountain in Game of Thrones, which is maybe the most memorable fight in that entire show. Zoro vs. Mr. 7 is significantly better. Yes, of course the Viper vs. the Mountain is far more epic because of all the drama and stakes and storytelling behind it, but I'm saying just the actual fight, the actual action, it's a joke compared to Zoro vs. Mr. 7. Because in this show, the actors can actually fight. The camera doesn't have to cut away every half second. So if I were a blind viewer of the One Piece live action, then by the time I got to the bar scene where Makinyu beats up the Marines in episode 1, I would already consider this a watchable series, because even that bar fight of Zoro just stomping Marines is a much more visually entertaining bar fight than the vast majority of television shows. And while I'd say Makinyu's fights are the best standout, watching Luffy fight is fun too, because if you can accept the weirdness of the CGI, then the rubberness of his combat actually becomes wildly entertaining in live action. More so than the manga, in fact, because a character stretching in a comic, well, at a certain point you kind of take that for granted. But seeing a human fighting by stretching in live action is much more novel. I also thought that the red-haired pirates bar fight scene was very stylish as well, and had some really flashy and innovative use of pistols. I could go on, but overall, I can't praise the action enough. I would watch this again just for the fights. On the flip side, the scene direction was very hit or miss for me. I'll start with what I personally did not like. It really felt like the series struggled to find a consistent style that it wanted to hit, because at times it seemed like it wanted to be cartoony, but at other times it seemed to try for some very raw, realistically depicted drama. And in this medium, you kind of need to pick a lane, stick to a style, and work with whatever degree of drama and emotion you can reasonably hit within that style without having it feel tonally inconsistent. It's just a little weird when, for example, a scene is being filmed perfectly normally, and then there's this sudden amateurish zoom as Luffy stabs himself in the eye. Or once in a blue moon, suddenly we get split screens between characters, or randomly we get a scene with a bunch of close-ups but with extremely tilted camera angles, and that really is a big one. There are so many Dutch angles for absolutely no reason. Maybe it's to give it all a more comic book feel, but again, consistency matters, and there are so many other scenes that are shot more traditionally, and actually those work a lot better for me to actually take the show's attempts at drama more seriously. For instance, Zoro and Nami having the conversation at Baratier where they make each other drink. That is a simply directed scene composed of medium close-up shots that progress to close-up shots as the conversation goes deeper, and with some overhead shots of the table and drinks mixed in throughout for style. But that simplicity works. That scene feels like a real TV show. It feels like real drama, real characters, and it doesn't need to get too fancy. But then in the next scene, literally the very next scene, you have Garp and Kobe having this weighty discussion about fairness and freedom in Garp's cabin, filled with all these grandiose, tilted close-ups and dramatic music shoehorned in that actually makes it hard to take the discussion seriously. It's as though there are totally different visions for what the feel of the show should be between episode to episode and even scene to scene. Don't get me wrong, obviously elements have to feel cartoony for the universe to make sense. We've got a rubber boy as the main character, and his first scene is talking to a bird that delivers the news. And some scenes that are meant to be very theatrical and over the top were awesome, like Buggy's circus introduction. Perfect. Give me all the Dutch angles there. But I think the issue I have is that just because the world needs to feel stylized in some ways does not mean that you need to go all in with crazy camera angles and a million cuts for the conversations and moments that need to feel more grounded. I feel there are several moments in the series that are hard for me to take seriously, that come across as even silly or melodramatic simply because of the direction choices. At the same time, I think the single best scene of the show was Nami's emotional breakdown as she had all of her money stolen, leading into Help Me. And that whole sequence was, for the most part, shot in a more raw, realistic manner, especially as she's screaming while she's being restrained to the ground. And that full sequence genuinely had me in tears, because for the most part, It did not feel cartoony, it did not feel stylized, it felt like this was a real person experiencing real pain. And in that vein, I do think a lot of the more grounded and effective scene direction was present in the later episodes, so I don't mean to say that there were not plenty of scenes that I thought were really well directed. They also just so happened to be the scenes that were less stylized. Sanji's backstory felt like a believably scary and tense situation. Luffy talking to Zoro while Zoro was unconscious, where the camera was still, everything was quiet, and the pacing was slow. Those are the types of scenes I hope to see more of in Season 2. And lastly, I'll say my favorite shot of the season was a live-action original from behind Luffy's hat as he looked up at the stars while sitting on the roof in Kokoyashi Village. So more creative shots like that in Season 2, please. Now we get to the writing. By the standards of any TV show, the characterization for the main cast is very strong. The three personalities of Luffy, Zoro, and Nami are very well defined, and Usopp and Sanji get less time, but they still get their backstories and such as well. I genuinely think that most TV shows do not go to these lengths to flesh out the entire main cast this much, with full episodes dedicated to each of them and their backstories. If I compare these 5 main characters to most of the recent TV shows that I have watched, particularly in the fantasy or science fiction genre, I would confidently say that yes, the level of characterization that each of the Straw Hats individually get here is much more than the vast majority of TV shows, at least in the first season of most shows. That is without a doubt a huge strength of this live action, though that is of course largely because Oda wrote these backstories and story arcs for the characters in the first place. But again, if I'm pretending I don't know One Piece at all, then one of my first initial impressions would be, wow, they really spent a lot of time on each of these characters. I think even if I wasn't a One Piece fan going in, I would come out loving or at least caring about all of the Straw Hats by the end of the season, with, if I'm being honest, maybe the exception of Usopp, simply because so far he feels the least important. However, when it comes to the actual dialogue, it's more of a mixed bag. Matt Owens, if by any chance at all you're watching this, I have one bit of feedback for you, take it or leave it. Have more faith in yourself. The reason I say this is because the absolute most frustrating thing about the dialogue to me would be that often there was a theme or message or character motivation that needs to be communicated, and very often we would get a bit of dialogue that's really good, that communicates what needs to be communicated very elegantly without being heavy-handed. But then that would very often be thrown away shortly afterwards by a character just very bluntly spelling out that same point in a very on-the-nose manner with zero subtlety at all. For instance, on the roof in Kokoyashi Village, you have Zoro questioning Luffy, asking Luffy how he knows he's right about Nami. After everything she's done, how does Luffy know that he's right about her? And Luffy responds by saying, well, the same way that he knew that he was right that Zoro wouldn't kill him when he freed him. The same way he knew about Usopp. The same way he knew about Sanji. The same way that Luffy knew about all of them, he knows about Nami too. I thought that was really well put, as it takes us back through the entirety of the season, this journey and the bonds that have been made so far, and it encapsulates who Luffy is. Luffy is someone that thinks for himself and is able to see the good in people when everyone else says otherwise. That's it. That's all you need. That right there is great dialogue. Luffy has made his point to Zoro and to the viewer in an understated manner. Luffy has communicated that I've made it this far. No, we've made it this far because I've trusted my gut and seen the good in people. But the scene doesn't stop there. Right after this, there's one extra line written in my opinion completely unnecessary, that throws the subtlety of the previous dialogue out the window. Luffy just outright explains, I know Nami is good. He very plainly spells out what he had already effectively implied. Now suddenly it feels more like simplistic writing to me. And in general, the season was permeated with dialogue where Luffy just spelled everything out. Like saying to Kuro, being a pirate is about adventures and freedom. Or telling Arlong, Nami's not a tool to be used, she's a person with wants and dreams of her own. Or, you're just like all those guys that hurt other people. The reason those lines are disappointing to me is I think the season is also filled with great lines. And the best lines in this season are again precisely those where the meaning is implied rather than spelled out. For example, when Sanji is talking to Zeph about quitting Baratier, Zeph responds by saying, quitting is staying here. Great. Awesome. a perfect way to phrase the entire message of the importance of chasing dreams that the Baratie arc is all about. Or when Luffy is telling Nami he can't believe that she's a member of the Arlong Pirates, and she responds with the line, "You only believe what you want to believe," basically simultaneously referring to the current situation, but also punctuating their prior argument where Nami was telling Luffy that Luffy's beliefs in dreams is delusional and that Luffy is ignorant of reality. With lines like those, the ideas don't need to be outright stated. The writing is sharp, it's great, just trust that the deeper meaning of certain lines don't need to be spelled out to the viewer. That aside, there are more details about the dialogue I could go into. I think some lines were, in my opinion, cheesy, but many lines were genuinely cool, witty, or badass, and the one thing I felt was consistently good was the comedy and banter. It was never overdone, I never felt like jokes or one-liners were being written in just for the sake of it, and a lot of lines really made me laugh. Now, regarding the overall story, I think the flow is really strong. The beginning is about bringing the main trio of characters together and establishing the running conflicts against the Marines and the Arlong Pirates. Then the Syrup Village section is a lot slower to flesh out the characters as well as to build the dynamic between the main characters. Then you have Baratie, which is the dramatic midpoint of the arc where everything comes to a head and the heroes experience a sense of defeat and failure. Always an absolute necessity for any well-written story, and then the rise back up for a final battle in Arlong Park, of course. The overall plot has momentum. It devotes plenty of time for us to learn about the characters and time for us to see them grow and bond with each other. There is a very well orchestrated and heavy low point partway through the arc, and plenty of emotion heading into the climax. On a macro level, the story of this TV show is genuinely great. I am going to take a bit of time to talk about the strongest section, which was the low point, the midpoint, because a lot of ideas and character writing really came together here. So Baratie worked as a sort of crescendo, first building internal tension among the crew prior to the Mihawk duel, with Nami pushing back against Luffy's philosophy of letting people chase their dreams no matter the risk. Then Mihawk defeating Zoro and putting him on the brink of death, in a way justifying Nami's beliefs and putting a great burden on Luffy's beliefs. And that then being followed up by Arlong arriving and actually crushing Luffy. All of that concludes with Nami then betraying the crew. I honestly think that even if I was not a One Piece fan, during these scenes, I would legitimately be very invested in this whole storyline, and particularly in Nami's betrayal and why she is doing it. And I think I would genuinely feel for the normally happy, go-lucky, carefree Luffy basically being called delusional as he is forced to grapple with his failures and shortcomings as a captain. I even think having Arlong throw Luffy in the water at the end of all this, and the symbolism of literally seeing Luffy slowly drowning and sinking further and further down, was a great decision. And of course, who saves him? His crew. And from there is the start of a great rise back up. See, there's a really well set up scene right after this where Luffy has his talk with the unconscious Zoro. This scene is a follow-up to an earlier scene that took place right before Baratie, where as the crew approached Baratie, Zoro tries to go have a talk with Luffy and get Luffy to open up, and Luffy basically says no, and Zoro says, "Good talk," and leaves it at that. And this was supposed to be played off as a joke, but at the same time, it reflected that the crew was still not yet as closely bonded as they needed to be to have a genuine heart-to-heart with one another. And so to close out Baratie, we finally have Luffy, who is trying to overcome his self-doubt, who is trying to get a foothold again as a captain after he's been betrayed by his own crew, been told that he's delusional, been told that his philosophies and beliefs are wrong, and that he's a bad captain. We have this Luffy trying to have a real talk with Zoro, and Zoro actually wakes up and firmly pledges his loyalty to Luffy. This moment validates Luffy as a captain. It proves Luffy was right to encourage his crewmates to chase their dreams, even if it meant risking their lives, and it gives Luffy the confidence to trust his gut again. And from here, he knows he's correct to go after Nami and rescue her. This also coincides with Sanji finally choosing to follow his dreams, and he joins up with Luffy, yet again proving that Luffy's philosophy and encouragement as a leader was right all along. This whole section is just great storytelling. Again, on a micro level, some of the dialogue and some of the individual scene direction in this section may have felt corny or cheesy at times to me, but the overall ideas of the story are perfectly thought out. Now, on the flip side, I felt the weakest episode was episode 8 actually. I feel that after episode 6 and episode 7 built up so much drama and emotional investment Towards the final conflict with Arlong, it was a big surprise to me that there was so little time actually allocated for defeating Arlong. It went by really quickly, and that was then followed up by the even more anticlimactic Garp and Luffy confrontation. I already explained earlier my major issues with the storyline, but the biggest problem that I didn't mention is that even if I knew nothing about One Piece, even if I was watching this completely blind, I would view this as just a straight up bad plotline for a TV show. Because I personally would lose all interest in this marine plotline the moment that it was established that Garp is actually Luffy's grandfather and Garp is expressly not trying to actually kill Luffy. The moment this is established, the entire marine storyline no longer adds any sense of stakes to the story. We now know Garp is not a real enemy. I now view the Marines as basically an inconvenience at best. It's weird to keep cutting to the Marines and playing up how hell-bent and serious Garp is to capture Luffy, like it's this hammer hanging over the heroes' heads, when it's also been established that he's more just like an upset father figure at this point. There's just no reason to care or take the Marines seriously at this point because they're not established to be a real threat. It's painfully clear that nothing serious is going to come of this. It's basically like having a Disney Channel villain following them around. As I discussed earlier in the video, the Garp storyline also didn't do much more for the themes or Luffy's character, so all in all, it is a pretty blatant issue with the overarching story in my opinion, as it adds no stakes, no tension, has little effect on the plot, and just leads to a very predictable resolution, all while taking up a ridiculous amount of story time. And finally, I want to talk about the acting performances. I feel so ashamed that I thought Iñaki Godoy sounded cringe when I heard the first teaser. He is by far my favorite member of the cast, and I think the entire show owes a lot to Iñaki Godoy because I think he literally sets the tone for the entire world. See, as I talked about earlier, the series can feel cartoonish, but even a little amateurish or unpolished at times, but Iñaki's performance is so enthusiastic and genuinely whimsical that it's like it encourages the viewer to just give in and not think too much about if some set piece looks a bit artificial or some visual effect or scene direction seems a little odd or goofy. Whereas Nami, Zoro, and even Usopp's actors are more grounded in their performance, Iñaki basically makes you feel like, okay, this isn't meant to be realistic. It's okay if some stuff feels weird or absurd. Sometimes Iñaki was given certain lines that I felt were a little corny, but he delivers them with so much enthusiasm that I just looked past it. There are also a few points that I suppose, because of his accent, that it felt like maybe his articulation of certain lines was a little garbled, or it felt like he was just reciting words. But what's crazy is that even in those rare moments where I felt that way, it didn't matter because his attitude and his expressions and his personality just always shone through and made his performance enjoyable at all times. This show is so lucky that they found this kid because I think Luffy is a ridiculously difficult role to cast, and he beyond nailed it. I still think most of the rest of the cast was great as well. Makinyu as Zoro was awesome. He could easily have just ended up as a dull, lifeless performance due to the demeanor the character is supposed to give off, but even though Makinyu was very stoic, he also had a very sharp intensity underneath. Just through his expressions, he really communicated Zoro's resolve, and overall, I would describe it as a quietly intense performance, which I think is hard to pull off. It helped that he was given a lot of great one-liners, and what was really impressive is that he was actually also able to pull off a lot of the funniest comedic lines while still maintaining almost the exact same expression and mood. Emily Rudd had, of course, by far the most emotionally powerful performance, with huge props to the entire breakdown and help me scene in episode 7. I don't have a ton to say other than she really made me f***ing cry, like, a lot. But even outside that one scene, I think she really played the entire season with a certain trajectory in mind, as in she goes from being very cold and detached to us slowly seeing more and more cracks in that persona, to finally seeing everything just break and all these pent-up emotions from the decades of suffering come out. I really thought episode 7 was the best episode, and it's almost entirely because of her. Jacob Romero as Usopp, I think he did the best he could do with what he was given. That's not to say he wasn't good. I think he was really good, but he just deserved more. I think he pulls off telling a bunch of lies and bragging a lot without it ever becoming annoying, which is really important for bringing Usopp to the live action. Now, this actor just needs some more dramatic material to work with. Taz Skylar is a totally different Sanji. It almost feels like an entirely different character from the manga. I know this section of the video is not about comparing things to the manga, but I just have to mention it. He's very smiley, cheery, and upbeat, and I think that decision was made for the show because Zoro and Nami are both very cold, stoic, and serious personalities in the show, at least relative to their manga versions. So you have to take greater efforts to diversify the personalities of the crew in the live action more, which is why I think we got a Sanji that is much, much lighter in the show compared to the manga. And it works because Taz is immediately likable as Sanji. From the side characters, I felt like the actors for Shanks, Zeph, Kaya, and actually Buggy were the standouts. Shanks is phenomenal. I feel bad that this dude got hate just because of one shot that framed him poorly in the teaser. He perfectly captures this laid-back but simultaneously wise and sage-like persona. Zeph's scene where it's revealed that he ate his leg was a great performance. It was actually probably the rawest acting performance that we got in the show, up till, of course, Emily Rudd in episode 7. Kaya was a pleasant surprise. She really became a sympathetic figure very quickly, and I appreciated that they expanded on her role because the actress was good. And Buggy, this dude was so much fun in the second episode. Just really a big, entertaining personality. It was literally always fun to see him on screen, so I'm happy that they made him a recurring character here. I'm not gonna say that I thought every performance was good, but most were, and most importantly, the Straw Hats were all well cast, which is going to be the most important aspect for the show in the long run. So overall, this live action is, in my eyes, a huge success. I still can't believe something like this is real. I still can't believe how much I enjoyed it. I still can't believe how much I'm looking forward to more of this show. I honestly now view it as another version of One Piece. I view Iñaki Godoy as Luffy, a different version of Luffy. Same with Makinyu as Zoro, Emily Rudd as Nami, and so on. They are all now, in my mind, a new version of the Straw Hat crew that I'm invested in following the adventures of. And the fact that it's willing to deviate from the plot of the source material makes the show more exciting for me, because I know it's still going to hit all the most important beats and ideas, but it's also going to tell the stories in a completely different and unpredictable way. So, it's as though I'll get to relive One Piece again from the start. What we have is an alternate retelling. What more could you ask for as a One Piece fan? Critically speaking, just looking at it as any other TV show, pretending I'm not already a One Piece fan, well, from that perspective, maybe I was a little harsh in some ways. I don't know, but I also dislike most TV shows. So I think the fact that I'm pretty sure I'd find this one enjoyable and fun, even if I wasn't already a One Piece fan, I think that's pretty good. But let me know how you all enjoyed the live action in the comments below. What were your favorite scenes, your favorite changes, your favorite performances, all of that. And if you want my extended thoughts on my favorite and least favorite moments, you can listen to my weekly podcast by supporting me on Patreon. Just hit the link in the description below.